It's another connection between what you say about how flow is, we're sort of wired for flow. It's connected to our adaptive capabilities. It's evolutionarily, obviously, very useful. I want to talk to you about a concept that you write a lot about, very, very interestingly, the challenge to scale ratio. So I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and our ultimate hero growing up was Michael Jordan. And I think we superficially understood Jordan's mentality at the time as this sort of very hard driving mentality, always push yourself. I mean, today people talk about hustle culture. You have a lot of this mentality in the corporate world, the 80-hour weeks, work till you drop, basically push as hard as you can for as long as you can. I think, again, I think this is an oversimplification of what the masters do, but it's the way that it's understood by a lot of people. And in the challenge to scale, balancing the challenge to scale ratio, and in other concepts you talk about, sort of seem to point towards a much trickier balance. So in flow, it turns out that we sometimes use a lot less of the brain and not more. There's also a relaxation or a release phase leading to peak performance, this lowering of brain activity. So it's not so simple as just pushing yourself to the brink and just always doing more. Can you talk a little bit about why that is? Why we actually need a trickier balance between pushing ourselves super hard and also relaxing to kind of create that optimal experience?
So inadvertently, there's like four questions sort of mashed together. So I'm gonna say this out loud so you can remind me, because in 5 minutes when I go, where the hell was I and what did I need to say? So let's start with the challenge skills balance, and then let's go to the flow cycle, because there's two parts to this. But I want to start actually with something funny, because people don't realize this about Jordan. So play versus comp, like the image of Jordan is like fierce competition, it's like the Kobe, the Mamba mentality, and all, right? All that stuff. And by the way, I'm wired that way on a lot of levels, and I totally get it. And it's really funny because I'll listen to like Kobe's speeches, and I will think to myself two things. I will think, oh, he sounds a little bit like you, and two, he sounds fucking crazy, right? Like you hear it out loud, you're like, wow, that just sounds crazy, right? But on the inside, it doesn't feel crazy. And the reason is the challenge skills balance. But even before we get there, so play is universal in mammals. And there are biological, physiological telltale signs of play. In animals, we always see the play bow, right? You put your chest to the ground. Dogs do this all the time. It goes across species. Humans sort of do. We just lower our posture a little. But one of the signs that you are playing, and play is really flowy, is that you have your tongue hanging out of your mouth. That's always a sign that you're playing, right? It's universal in mammals. And the thing about Jordan, like whatever you want to say about like the Mamba mentality, I'm grinding out, whatever, your facial expression says you're playing. And so however hard you're going, you're playing, you're out there playing, and that's flowy as hell. And it's worth pointing that out because nobody ever talks about it. But like, there's no, think about, why would you play basketball with your tongue sticking out of your mouth? There's no reason to do it unless it was actually, so that is worth pointing out. Besides the point, or besides challenge skills balance, flow follows focus. We pay the most attention to the task at hand when that challenge of the task slightly exceeds our skill set. So you want to stretch but not snap, right? And so the easiest way to talk about this is to put some numbers on it, and these are not real numbers. So a bunch of years ago, before he passed, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, godfather of flow psychology, sat down with a Google mathematician, and they said, can we put a number on the difference between challenge and skills? The back of the envelope calculation, this was not real. The number they came up with was 4%. We took that 4% and tried to play with it and tried to test it and ran a couple years worth of like, you can't call them research yet because it was really hard to like, how do you map 4% exact? Like it was weird and hard and tricky. And, but we found that it was deadly accurate, like as a metaphor at least. And what we found with 4% is like, for if you're shyer, if you're meek, if you're timid, if you're a little cautious, or if you're any of those areas where that comes up in your personality, right? Like you may not be a shy, timid person, but you may not like public speaking, and suddenly you're like, we can go to speak in public and suddenly you're shy and timid, whatever the case. Flow demands that you get comfortable with being uncomfortable. You got to push slightly outside your ski spot. Hard charging type A types will take on challenges that are 10, 20, 30, 40% bigger than their skill level, just for like the thrill of it and because it helps them pay attention, right? And I'm not saying don't go after the big challenges. Those are actually great for motivation, but you got to chunk it down so what's right in front of you is slightly above your skill set, right? So you're back in that 4% sweet spot. And here's something that's interesting. Most of my work in the past couple of years has been on peak performance aging. And as we age, as unconscious fears sort of build up, you get injured, things go wrong, you start to build up so on. That sweet spot may shrink even further. So what may be like 4% at 30 can get down to like 2% in your 50s. And especially like if you're an athlete in your 50s, you're used to pushing like 4 or 5%, and pushing 2% doesn't feel right because you've learned it one way and now you have to shift it and you find yourself locked out of flow. And it's because you're actually pushing too hard. You back off more, you'll get in. And the way I like to talk about it is in flow, it's often you got to go slow to go fast. The next step out, and then I'll shut up. So you can see the next question is flow is not a light switch. It's not a binary. You're not in the zone or out of the zone. It's actually a 4-stage process. And you got to move through each stage to get back into flow. And the first stage is a struggle phase. You're loading the brain with information, and it's very unflowy, right? You talked about how the prefrontal cortex gets quiet in flow. In struggle, it's super active. It's trying to puzzle solve. It's trying to learn stuff. It's acquiring skills and acquiring knowledge and preparing, right? And you sort of want to bring yourself to the brink of total frustration. Then you want to pause. You mentioned that, like, you want to relax. You want to chill, right? You want to take your mind off the problem. Flow requires you to like learn this stuff consciously and then pass it over to the subconscious, which is way more powerful and can do a lot of problem solving, puzzle solving, and learning for you. So to do that, you got to take your mind off the problem. And so like low-grade physical activity is great here. This is why you hear so many people talking about long walks, right? I love walking my dogs for like this activity. Gardening works really, really well. You can work out, but you don't want to exhaust the brain because what comes next is flow. So you just want to relax. This is, by the way, people have great ideas in the shower. Why? It's because you struggle all day with the thing and you come home and you jump into the shower and it's not exactly a flowy experience, but it's got some of the flow triggers baked in. And it's just enough to distract you that suddenly the good ideas start popping, and suddenly you find yourself in the front end of like a cognitive flow state in the shower. All of a sudden, here's the answer. Right. So that's the experience a lot of us have had. And then on the back end, there's a recovery phase. So you gotta like flow's neurobiologically expensive to produce. It's a heavy state. We use a lot of energy. So you gotta chill out. And really, if you want to really use flow to your advantage, you need deep delta wave sleep because a lot of learning takes place in flow. But until you get into deep delta wave sleep, have a good night's sleep, you can't turn it from short-term memory into long-term storage. It won't make that jump. You need sleep on the back end of a flow state. So you need an active recovery protocol and a lot of sleep. I want to go back to something a loop we left open earlier. Flow's got these 6 conditions. You can be in microflow, which is when they show up, but they're dialed down to like 1 or 2. So you said most of these people don't even believe they've been in flow. They've all had the experience where they sit down to write like a quick email to the boss. And like you get so sucked into what you're doing that an hour goes by and you look up and you're like, oh my God, I wrote an essay. And maybe like your sense of self and self-consciousness didn't totally go away, but bodily awareness sure did, because you pop back into consciousness. You have to run to the bathroom because you hadn't been aware of the fact that your bladder had been screaming at you for like 20 minutes, right? It happens to all of us all the time. The other end of the spectrum, macro flow, where it's turned up to 11. For a long time, people thought these were mystical experiences, right? They didn't know it was flow. They didn't know what it was. And weird things happen in macro flow. Time can slow down. You can have a sense of being one with everything. You can have out-of-body experiences. We understand all the neurobiology under where that comes from now, but it doesn't change the fact that when you have those experiences, they're wild. You know what I mean? I'm one of the leaders in the world on this stuff, but I have a deep flow experience. It still feels like a mystical experience to me, right? That doesn't go away. That's what makes it so wonderful.